Hello and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a certified personal trainer and nutrition coach, and my mission is to help you get into the best shape of your life, regardless of your age, so that you can show up in life as the healthiest, strongest, most vital version of yourself. I want to let you know that if you enjoy this podcast, I have additional free resources over at silveredgefree.com. There you'll find my mini guides on nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle. Now, today we have another edition of the Coach's Corner, so no guest today, it's just me, and we'll be back next week with our regular interview format. Here's what we're covering in today's episode. I'll start out with some breaking news on the state of this podcast, and then spend a few minutes answering the question, which is better for fat loss, cardio or strength training? Then I spend a few minutes talking about the basics of human functional movement. After that, I'll give an update on how things are going with my client Brock. If you're not familiar, Brock is a podcaster himself. He's the host of the Midlife Mastery podcast, and he's hired me as his personal trainer and nutrition coach, and he suggested that we share our journey on our respective podcasts, me from the coach's perspective and Brock from the client's perspective. He's on a journey to get into the best shape of his life in his 50s, and he'd like to lose some weight and regain some of the strength that he had when he was younger. I cover most of this in the earlier editions of the Coach's Corners, so today we're going to pick up where we left off. I then spend a little bit of time talking about a recent guilty pleasure of mine, and after that I do a quick book review of a book titled Diet for Great Sex by Christine Delosier. And then I wrap up with a brief discussion on my main takeaways from some of my recent podcast guests. Okay, let's get on with today's show. This just in. So let's start with some breaking news. At the time of this recording, our humble little Over 50 Health and Wellness podcast is ranked number 32 on the most popular podcasts in the iTunes fitness category. And we peaked at number 23 last week, which is incredible. I haven't looked at these stats in quite a while, frankly, because they were discouraging. And this podcast was pretty consistently in the 120s, 130s ranking. Anyway, I want to thank each and every one of you who are listening today. This isn't a show without you tuning in. And I especially want to give a huge shout out to those who have been listening for a while. I published my first episode over a year ago, back in April of 2020, right as the pandemic was getting into full swing, and this show has come a long way since then. My mission is to continue honing my podcast skills to make this show the best it possibly can be, and I want to sincerely thank you for helping make this podcast a success. What's better for burning fat? Cardio or strength training? Everybody knows that cardio is the best way to lose weight and burn fat, right? Not so fast. Like many things in the exercise and nutrition universe, the answer is nuanced. But the prevailing notion of reduced calories and increased cardiovascular activity has been around for a long time and has proven time and again to be a failure when it comes to long-term weight loss. Now, before we go any further in this discussion, let me clarify that you absolutely should do cardio. There are a multitude of health benefits from regularly doing cardiovascular exercises. But this prevailing notion that cardio is the best way to burn body fat is simply flawed. And here's why. When we consider how many calories we burn in an activity like jogging versus how many calories we burn, say, when lifting weights, jogging wins, hands down. For example, we'd probably burn somewhere in the neighborhood of, say, 350 calories on a 30-minute jog. Compare that to maybe a measly 100 calories burned in 30 minutes of weightlifting. So based on that information alone, the case is closed. Cardio is the clear winner. But here's the problem with that equation. Of all the benefits exercise gives us, the least valuable things in terms of long-term sustainable weight loss is the actual amount of calories burned while you're doing it. Your body is incredibly good at adapting to stress, and the more you do cardio, the more efficient your body becomes, primarily by paring muscle down and slowing down your metabolism. And this is the exact opposite outcome those of us over 50 want. We want to hold on to as much muscle mass as possible, and we want our metabolism to speed up, not slow down. So here's a typical scenario. You find yourself 20 pounds overweight and you decide that's it, you're going on a diet and you're going to lace up those running shoes and get out there for that 3-mile run 3 or 4 days a week. And at first you make great progress, at least as far as the scale is concerned. You lose those first 5, 6, maybe 7 pounds and then you plateau. Well, dang, back to the drawing board. You decide it's time to get serious. So you cut even more calories and you add even more cardio. Now you've lost another 3 or 4 pounds and you plateau again. And you repeat this cycle. And you lose a couple more pounds and plateau yet again. And by now you're in this very unhealthy and unsustainable position where you've severely restricted your calories and you're constantly running or biking or doing aerobics, swimming, etc. And what happens now is that your body's going into survival mode. Again, your body is amazingly adaptable and it can adjust to almost anything. And now your brain is signaling your body to strip away any unnecessary muscle, store as much fat as possible, and to slow your metabolism to a crawl in order to preserve energy. And most likely you're miserable at this point. By now you're likely hungry most of the time, your hormones are out of whack, you aren't sleeping well, and eventually you give up. And then you slowly gain the weight back, maybe even a little extra to boot. And now you find you're 25 pounds overweight and you decide to start the cycle all over again. You restrict calories and start back on the cardio. This unfortunate scenario is played out over and over again, and it wreaks metabolic havoc on your body, to say nothing about your emotional state. Now, before we go any further, let's spend a minute talking about muscle, specifically type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So you may know that type 1 muscles are known as slow twitch muscle fibers, and they're commonly used for endurance activities like walking, hiking, running, biking, swimming, etc. And your type 2 muscle fibers are your fast twitch muscles, and they support quick, powerful movements such as sprinting and weightlifting. Many of you are probably familiar with the term sarcopenia, which refers to age-related muscle loss. And you may even have heard the statistic that we lose on average about 3 to 5% of muscle mass every decade after the age 30. Now, most, if not all, of that age-related muscle loss can be arrested by regular strength training as we age. But here's the thing. We preferentially lose type 2 muscle mass as we age. In other words, our bodies are pretty good at hanging on to type 1 muscle fibers as we age. And so by doing a ton of cardio and ignoring strength training, we further signal the body to get rid of this valuable type 2 muscle. And type 2 muscle is metabolically expensive. In other words, your body has to rev up its metabolism to support this muscle. And we know that our bodies love efficiency, and if all we're doing is cardio, our bodies will gladly get rid of that expensive muscle tissue, which is exactly what we do not want as aging adults. Now, before we go any further, I had a fantastic conversation with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon a few weeks back on this show, and she makes the case that muscle, specifically type 2 muscle, is the organ of longevity. If you haven't already checked that episode out, I strongly recommend you do, and you can find that at silveredgefitness.com/episode 72. Okay, so back to the original question. What's better for fat loss, cardio or strength training? So we've shown that the actual activity of cardio does in fact burn more calories than the activity of strength training, but I want to make the case that the number of calories we burn while actually training is the least significant part of that fat loss equation, at least for that long-term sustainable fat loss equation. When we do strength training, we build valuable type 2 muscle, which directly speeds up your metabolism. So now let's imagine that you've started a good strength program, and let's just ignore the scale for now, and you start getting stronger and you start building muscle. And instead of restricting your calories, you start making healthier food choices and prioritizing protein, which is a necessary component of growing new muscle. Now all of a sudden, instead of slowing down your metabolism the way we did when we cut calories and did constant cardio, we're actually speeding up your metabolism. You're now burning more calories, more fat throughout the entire day, not just while you're working out. So picture this. You've gotten stronger, you've reached your ideal weight, and now you're actually eating more, not less than when you started this weight loss journey. Now that's a sustainable approach. Oh, and as an added bonus, you're now stronger, healthier, more vital, and more of a badass than you were before. And now look, I know that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but this is one of the biggest mistakes I see in people over 50 making. The prevailing wisdom has been to cut calories and do cardio for weight loss for so long that it's seldom questioned. But hopefully this discussion has given you enough information to make you pause and reflect about the healthiest way to reach your ideal body weight in a sustainable fashion. I want to take a few minutes to talk about functional movements. You may be familiar with the term functional fitness. The fitness industry loves this term, but basically functional fitness refers to exercise movements or programs that train the body to complete natural human movements. Your body is an amazing machine. It was designed to move in many different ways. Your body should be capable of walking, running, jumping, hinging, squatting, pushing, pulling, lunging, climbing, picking things up and putting them into overhead spaces, bending, twisting, balancing, swimming, and even pirouetting. You should be capable of short, intense bouts of energy, as well as longer, slower efforts. Unfortunately, many of us in the over 50 crowd have lost many of these abilities. And there are many reasons for this, but the most prevalent reason is inactivity and a sedentary lifestyle. Experts in human movement agree that we have 7 functional or primal movement patterns. And the 7 functional movement patterns are squat, lunge, push, pull, hinge, twist, and gait. Way back when, our ancestors had to master all of these movements simply for survival. If you couldn't make the long trek to the hunting ground, gait, then throw your spear, lunge, twist, and push, then lift and carry, squat, hinge, pull, gait, your prey back to camp, you were going to go hungry that night. While most of us no longer need these types of survival skills, Uber Eats will bring whatever you want right to your door, your body is not caught up with these modern times, and the inability to correctly move in these functional patterns can severely impact our health. Let's take a look at each of these movements and evaluate where you are today and where maybe you could use some improvement. First up is the squat. You should be able to perform a bodyweight squat. And to do this, stand with your feet shoulder-width apart, toes pointed slightly outward. You start the movement by sending your hips back and down while maintaining a neutral spine. Your knees track over your toes, and you lower until your hip crease is parallel with or lower than your knees. Squeeze your glutes and hamstrings and rise back to standing. If you don't have this movement available to you, try squatting to a chair or other raised surface and work on getting a little lower as you progress. The problem could be mobility related as opposed to strength related. If you can do bodyweight squats perfectly, it's time to add some load and get stronger. Number 2 on the list is lunge, and the most common version of this is the forward lunge. Keeping the back and spine neutral, simply step forward with one foot and bend your back knee until it gently touches the ground. Push off the forward foot explosively to return to the original position and lunge forward with the other leg. If you can't complete a full lunge, practice partial lunging until you've mastered the movement. Once you've mastered the forward lunge, it's time to add load and get stronger in this movement. Number 3 is push. Now, the best test here is the humble push-up. Most people are familiar with this movement. To perform a push-up, you'll lay on the ground with your hands next to your chest, brace your core, and push your hands into the ground until you've raised your body and your elbows are locked out. Your ankles, knees, hips, and shoulders should be in a straight line. You lower yourself with control. If you can't do a push-up, try to do them from your knees until you're strong enough to do them from your toes. Once you've mastered the push-up, you're ready to graduate to the bench press to increase your pushing strength. Number 4 is pull, and the gold standard for this movement is the king of bodyweight exercises, the pull-up. This is fairly straightforward. You hang from a bar and pull yourself up until your chin is over the bar, and then you lower with control. If you can't do a pull-up, you can use a heavy band to assist, or there may be machines in your gyms that mimic this, or you can do pull-up negatives to practice. To perform a pull-up negative, stand on a bench to get your chin over the bar, remove your feet from the bench, and lower yourself slowly. Once you've mastered a set of 10 pull-ups, congratulations, you can add weight to your body for added resistance. Number 5 on our functional movements is the hinge. And the best way to test a hinge is to deadlift, which is simply lifting an object from the ground. Place an appropriate object, a barbell works very good for this, on the ground and in front of you, and then with your feet shoulder width apart, unlock your knees and hinge forward until your hands reach your knees. Now from here, keeping your back neutral, your hips and shoulders sink down together until you reach the barbell or object. And now we're going to reverse these motions. Keeping our core braced and our arms straight, hips and shoulders will rise together until the hands reach the knees. The barbell should stay close to your body, maybe even lightly grazing your shins on the ascent. And at that point, when you reach the knees, you'll stand fully erect. As you get more proficient with this movement, add more load to increase your strength. Number 6 is twist. And twist refers to trunk rotation. And one of the best bodyweight tests for this is called the wood chop. To perform this movement, start with your feet shoulder width apart, a little wider is okay, and unlock your knees. Keep a neutral spine, you probably see a pattern here, and the chest is up. Clasp your hands and lift both arms straight up diagonally across your body towards the ceiling, and then bring them down to the other side of your body. You should be able to remain stable throughout this exercise, both feet stay planted, and the spine is straight. And number 7 is gait. And gait refers to walking, jogging, running, sprinting, even skipping, I suppose. And this is perhaps the most common of the movements, and you should be practicing some form of this daily. These essential movement patterns have deep and primal roots and affect our health and wellness in profound ways. Look for opportunities to improve these 7 functional movements every day, and your body, as well as your mind, will thank you. Okay, so if you've listened to any of my other Coach's Corner episodes, you know that one of my clients is a fellow podcaster. His name is Brock Edwards, and he's the creator and host of Midlife Mastery Podcast, and he's on a mission to get into the best shape of his life. He suggested that we each do periodic updates on our journey together on our respective podcasts. Me from the coach's perspective, and him, of course, from the client's perspective. If you'd like to listen to his updates, you can check him out at midlifemasterypodcast.com. So just to catch you up, Brock has already been through a 12-week what I call foundation phase. The intent of this phase was to reacquaint Brock with some of the barbell movements that he hasn't done in a while, and to get good at the basic movements. So the weights were relatively light and the volume relatively high. We were looking more for neurological adaptations more than actual strength adaptations in that phase. Although we still applied the principles of progressive overload. That is, we added a little bit of weight to his lifts each session. That phase was 3 times a week, and each session was a full body workout. Now, 3 weeks ago, Brock transitioned into his first actual strength phase. And this is very classic 3 sets of 5 reps of the major compound lifts, namely the squat, bench press, overhead press, deadlift, and bent over barbell row with a little bit of accessory work sprinkled in there. We're still at 3 sessions per week, and each session is still a full body session, and we're adding a little bit of weight to each of his exercises every session. This type of strength training is a basic staple as far as programming goes, and if you're interested in geeking out on the programming side of things, I recently had Andy Baker on the show, and we did a deep dive into strength training programming and progressions, and you can check that show out at silveredgefitness.com/episode 70. But the basic idea in this initial strength phase is to see how far we can go before Brock plateaus. Obviously, we can't keep adding weight each session indefinitely. Sooner or later, he's going to reach his max, and he won't be able to recover enough to complete the next session's prescribed weights. And when that happens, we'll change up his programming so that he's not really doing full body workouts every session. But for now, he's progressing nicely. He's getting stronger in each of his lifts. And as he finishes his third week of this, we'll move into a short deload week for his fourth week, which simply means that we're going to reduce the weights to about 60-ish% of what he was doing to give his body a chance to fully recover and get him ready for this next strength wave. Now, deload weeks can be tricky for some clients. There seems to be a temptation to do one of two things. Either blow them off completely, since the work seems pretty trivial compared to what you were doing, or more common and worse yet is to add weights or reps, since again it seems so easy. But deload weeks are a useful tool with this type of strength training. Most importantly, they promote recovery, and remember that we build muscle during recovery, but they also help prevent burnout and reduce the risk of over-injury. And they can also help postpone that dreaded plateau. So I've asked Brock to honor his deload week next week and just focus on moving with perfect form and allow his body to fully recover and get ready to get back after the heavy weights the next week. Now, nutritionally, Brock has recently plateaued in his weight loss. He's down about 12 pounds since we started together, which is fantastic, but his body seems to have settled into this new weight, which is not at all uncommon. The human body loves stasis, and in this case, his body has found a new baseline. My training software syncs with his MyFitnessPal, which is a food tracking app that counts calories as well as macros, which are proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. And this allows me to see exactly what and how much Brock is eating. And as we reviewed his most recent food logs, it looks like he's eating about 250 to 300 calories over his daily goal. So we talked about ways that he can cut roughly 300 calories a day from his current intake to get the scale moving again in that desired direction. If you'll remember back in, I think it was the very first Coach's Corner, I talked about the difficulties of working towards a weight loss goal and a strength gain goal simultaneously. In Brock's case, his primary goal is weight loss, with a secondary goal being strength gain. Long term, I'd love to see Brock get to his goal weight and then maybe switch his focus to strength gain, which would mean actually moving into a slight calorie surplus, which would be necessary to support serious muscle gain. But for now, the focus is on getting his weight moving downwards again, and will simultaneously work at getting him stronger as much as possible while he's in this calorie deficit. Okay, I want to talk to you folks about a new guilty pleasure of mine. So, full disclosure here, I don't typically recommend processed foods, and I personally try to eat as few processed foods as possible, but bear with me for a minute. My favorite podcast is a show called Mind Pump, and they do a daily show on all things fitness and nutrition, and one of their sponsors is a company called Magic Spoon, and they make, in their own words, healthy breakfast cereal that tastes too good to be true. So basically, they've created a cereal that tastes like the sugary cereals that most of us ate as kids, except that it's high protein, grain and gluten-free, sugar-free, soy-free, and naturally flavored. They claim it's childlike cereal for grown-ups. Anyways, I listen to this podcast every single day, and after hearing this advertisement over and over, I thought, what the heck? I absolutely love breakfast cereal, but I never eat it because, well, most of what's on the grocery store shelf is just complete crap. So I caved in and ordered a combo 4-pack, and I have to admit, these guys are onto something. This cereal really is delicious, and it has that nostalgic taste of childhood breakfasts. And as it turns out, they come in a bunch of flavors. They have fruity, which is very similar to Fruit Loops, peanut butter, one of my very favorites, cocoa, cinnamon, maple waffle, which is surprisingly delicious. They've got banana, strawberry, cookies and cream. Who remembers Cookie Crisp? And I think they do some seasonal specials. I just saw that they have, I think it's a pumpkin spice flavor coming out just now. So if you've listened to any of my past podcasts, you know that I'm just not a fan of processed food. And let's make no mistake, This is a highly processed food. But let's take a look at the nutrition info and then dig into some of the other ingredients. This is what originally caught my attention. This cereal is legit high protein. Depending on the flavor, a serving of Magic Spoon cereal ranges from 12 to 14 grams of protein. A serving size is 1 cup, and I've never in my life eaten only 1 cup of cereal. I typically eat 2.5, sometimes 3 cups as a serving, and that comes out to about 25, 30 plus grams of protein before I add my milk. So let's take a look at the nutrition label. Like I said, the serving size is 1 cup, and that 1 cup has 8 grams of fat, 14 grams of carbohydrate with 0 added sugars, and 13 grams of protein, and totals out to about 150 calories per serving. That's not too shabby for breakfast cereal, let's face it. But where does all this protein come from? And how can it be sugar-free and still taste so sweet? I mean, what sorcery is this? So let's take a look at the ingredients. First up is milk protein blend, which consists of whey protein isolate and casein. And if you're not familiar with casein, this is the main protein in milk, and it's commonly used in cheese making. Okay, so that's where our protein's coming from. Next up is their sweetener blend, which is made of monk fruit and allulose. And now we know where that sweetness comes from. We'll give monk fruit a pass, but allulose, which occurs naturally in small amounts in foods like figs and maple syrup, is in fact an ultra-processed artificial sweetener. And while this is, of course, deemed safe by the FDA, the jury is still out on artificial sweeteners in general, with many being correlated with negative health effects such as poor gut health, chronic disease, and even weight gain. Next up on their ingredient list is their oil blend, which is high oleic sunflower oil and avocado oil, and both of these fall into the healthy fats category. The rest of the ingredients are things like chicory root inulin, which is a form of prebiotic fiber, and things like peanut flour, cocoa powder, vegetable juice, turmeric, and spirulina, depending on what flavor we're talking about. So I'm going to give this a thumbs up on the protein and fat ingredients, but a thumbs down on the sweetener ingredients. But for what this is, namely a highly processed, delicious, childlike cereal, I've got to admit, it is my new guilty pleasure. If you're in a hurry or if you're having a hard time hitting your protein targets, this might be a great option. Better yet, if you're eating pretty much any other cereal, or your kids or grandkids are, you might want to consider swapping out for Magic Spoon. Now, one last thing, just so you know, this stuff is not cheap, at least not when compared to your average grain and sugar supermarket cereal. A box of Magic Spoon cereal without any discounts costs about $10, and each box has 5 servings, so that's about $2 a serving. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I typically eat 2, maybe 3 servings per sitting, so my cost is going to be a little higher than that, and that seems really high if I compare it to other cereals. But I don't really eat other cereals because there's simply no nutritional redeeming value in them. But now I can enjoy a nostalgic bowl of sweet cereal, guilt-free, as a treat from time to time. Okay, for my book review this week, I want to review a fun and informative book titled Diet for Great Sex, Food for Male and Female Sexual Health by Christine Delosier. Christine was on this show back in May of this year, and you can go back and listen to that episode wherever you get podcasts or at silveredgefitness.com/episode 49. Christine is an acupuncturist and an herbalist who specializes in sexual health. She holds a master's degree in acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, and counseling, and is a certified holistic nutrition counselor. She uses scientific evidence to uncover the best dietary habits for great sex by merging modern science with traditional Chinese medicine. And in this book, she breaks down what she calls the holy trinity of great sex from a nutritional standpoint. And that holy trinity is hormone balance, nerve integrity, and blood or vascular health. Now, hormones are fairly obvious and probably where most of us would start a conversation around diet and sexual health and well-being. And Christine discusses how we should eat in order to optimize our hormones for sexual performance. But next up is the nervous system. And Christine notes that as we age, our nerve impulses become weaker and slower and take longer to respond to stimuli. What this means for sex is that the communication between the genitals, the spinal cord, and the brain is not as good, which can result in less arousal and less pleasure. So she talks about diet tips for older folks to improve that nerve conduction and the critical role of antioxidants and omega-3 fatty acids for keeping our nervous system healthy. She then moves on to discuss the role of optimizing your diet for vascular health. When our blood vessels are damaged, they simply can't deliver adequate blood flow to the sexual organs, and we definitely want that nutrient-rich blood to get to the right places at the appropriate time. And of course, no book on diet and sex would be complete without a section on aphrodisiacs, and Christine has a great section on both the history and the efficacy of common and not so common aphrodisiacs. There's a ton of great nutritional advice in this book, as well as some great recipe ideas. And one of the things that struck me is the fact that eating for sexual health looks a whole lot like eating for optimal health in general. And another thing that surprised me was Christine's recommendation for a date night dinner. If you're anticipating a romantic evening with your significant other, what you eat for dinner can have a big impact on your sexual performance. When I think of date night dinner, I'm typically thinking of something decadent. Maybe a giant steak, a couple glasses of wine, and yes, please, to that luscious dessert. After all, it's date night. But none of that's going to optimize my hormones, nervous system, or vascular system. I'd be much better served having a green salad with a small piece of salmon, alcohol in moderation, and perhaps some pomegranate and berries with fresh ground cinnamon and cloves for dessert. Anyway, this is a great book and deserves a place on your bookshelf, and I'll drop a link to the book as well as the podcast episode I did with Christine. You can find all that at silveredgefitness.com/episode 76. Okay, moving into the home stretch here, I just want to recap some of the recent podcast guests that I've had on this show. 4 weeks ago, I interviewed Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. Dr. Lyon is on the front lines of the muscle-centric medicine movement, and her message is that muscle is the organ of longevity. And in fact, she states that our problem is less that we're overweight as an older population, but rather the real problem lies in the fact that we are under-muscled. This was a very thought-provoking conversation, and I personally took away a ton of good information. One of my main takeaways from this conversation was how much protein people over 50 should be eating per meal. As a nutrition coach, I've learned that as we age, our protein requirements increase, but it wasn't until this conversation that I really understood the mechanics of why that is. Basically, our ability to sense protein decreases as we age, and therefore we need to send a stronger protein signal for muscle building, which is why Dr. Lyon recommends a minimum of 30 grams of protein per meal. Anything less doesn't create a strong enough signal for us to fully utilize the muscle building properties of the protein we eat. If you want to hear the full conversation and get more details, I strongly suggest listening to this episode. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts or at silveredgefitness.com/episode 72. And you can also learn more about Dr. Lyon's work and her practice at her website, which is www.drgabriellelyon.com. And that's DRGABRIELLELYON.com. Okay. 3 weeks ago, I spoke with Dr. Stefan Zavlin about the dangers of prolonged sitting. Dr. Zavlin is a doctor of physical therapy and a workplace consultant whose mission is to try and change the culture of sitting in our workplace, which for many of us these days is home. And to be honest, when Dr. Zavlin reached out to me, I was unsure that this would be a topic that would resonate, but I'm so glad I had him on the show. I think we all know that prolonged sitting is bad for us, but I personally had no idea just how bad it was. nor did I realize how much we as a society actually sit. But here was the most alarming thing that I heard, was A, that the average U.S. office worker sits for 11 hours or more a day, and B, sitting for that amount of time increases your chance of early mortality by 40%. But here's the real scary part. When the researchers of that study factored in individuals who performed regular, moderate to high intensity exercise, their risk for premature death was not lessened. In other words, those of us that are active runners and gym goers, but then sit for most of the rest of the day, carry that same risk of premature death. You can tune into his show and learn more at silveredgefitness.com/episode 73. 2 weeks ago, I had 70-year-old Shelley Stetner on the show as my guest. She actually came up in my podcast with Andy Baker. Andy is Shelley's coach, and he talked a good bit about how impressive Shelley is as a competitive powerlifter. Now, Shelley had never touched a barbell in her life before age 65. In fact, at that point in her life, she considered herself to be a frail old lady and was actually considering retirement home options. Fast forward 5 years later to today, and she's a national powerlifting champion. This was a fun conversation. It was so inspiring, and it left me with the feeling that you're truly never too old and it's never too late to start. At one point in the interview, Shelley states that she's stronger than she's ever been and has more energy now at age 70 than she's ever had in her life. Again, you can find this episode wherever you listen to your podcasts, or this one was silveredgefitness.com/episode 74. Last week, Dr. Alyssa Kuhn was on the show as a guest, and we talked all about arthritis, specifically osteoarthritis, which is the most common form of arthritis. Alyssa is a doctor of physical therapy, and she's also the founder of a business called Keep the Adventure Alive, where her mission is to educate people that adventure is still possible with arthritis and that surgery is not inevitable. I personally had very little depth of knowledge in this area, and Dr. Kuhn talks about the prevalence of arthritis, what traditional treatments are usually prescribed, and she gives hope to people who may have been told in the past that pain-free movement simply is off the table for them. If you or a loved one is suffering from osteoarthritis, you definitely don't want to miss this episode, and you can listen again wherever you get your podcast, or this episode was silveredgefitness.com/episode 75. Okay, that's our show for today, folks. I'll put all the links to everything we talked about in the show notes, and you can find that over at silveredgefitness.com/episode 76. And don't forget to check out silveredgefree.com for more great free resources on how to live your healthiest, strongest life after 50. In the meantime, I'd love to hear from you. You can always leave a comment on this episode page, or feel free to email me with any comments or questions from today's show. Send emails to coach@silveredgefitness.com. I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I'll be back next week with my regular interview format, but that's it for today. So until next time, stay strong.